Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Zsuzsanna Végh. I'm a program officer at the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Trusts, and I'm happy to welcome you today at our panel discussion titled How the War in Ukraine Changed Russia's Power in the South Caucasus. Today's discussion takes place under the framework of the ReThink.CEE Fellowship. ReThink.CEE is a non-residential fellowship of the Transatlantic Trusts, and it is geared towards young researchers, analysts, and civic activists from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Its aim is to amplify fresh perspectives coming from these regions and also to support the professional development of young researchers across these geographies. The topic of today's discussion was actually the focus of our first ever Georgian ReThink.CEE fellow, Irakli Sirbiladze, who is a foreign policy analyst from Georgia, as I mentioned. His research focuses on Russia, Black Sea geopolitics, Georgia's foreign policy, including its relations with the European Union, NATO, Russia, and China. He is also an affiliate researcher at the PMC Research Center in Georgia. To discuss his topic, which he dedicated his past year to with us, we have with us two distinguished experts, Olesya Vartanyan and Laurence Broers. Olesya is an expert on security policy in the South Caucasus and has worked on conflicts in the region for over a decade, in part under the umbrella of the International Crisis Group until recently. Laurence is an associate fellow at the Chatham House and the Caucasus Program Director of Conciliation Resources. Laurence has both research experience on the conflicts in the South Caucasus, but is also a practitioner of peace-building initiatives in the region. Before we dive into the discussion today, a few housekeeping rules. We will start with a presentation by Irakli of his research dedicated to the topic, how Russia's influence changed in the South Caucasus over the past 2 years in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We will have a short round of initial feedback from Olesya and Laurence, and then we will move on to your questions and comments. Please, if you have any questions or would like to share your comments, feedback with us, put those down into the Q&A box. During our discussion, I will pick up your questions and we will discuss them in the panel. Today's discussion is recorded and we will be sharing it via YouTube on GMF's and the German Marshall Fund's Engaging Central Europe's program YouTube channels. Without further ado, then I would like to pass the floor to Irakli and once again thank both the panelists and our audience for joining us today. Irakli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsuzsanna. First off, I would like to thank the GMF and Zsuzsanna, you in particular, and Nick also, Daniel and Monica for all of your support throughout the fellowship. That really meant a lot. I would also naturally would like to thank Olesya and Laurence for taking their time and joining us in today's discussions. And I also would like to thank all the experts in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia who agreed to talk to me and share their insights on this issue when I was working on this in September and October last year. So let me now start off today's discussions and share some of my findings about how the war in Ukraine changed Russia's power in the South Caucasus. In the paper, I put forward several arguments or findings, if you like. The first one is that Russia's leverage over the three South Caucasus states have weakened overall, but the long, hard to undo dependencies that have been built over the decades still work in Russia's favor. So the second one is that Russia's unipolar moment has now come to an end in the region, and then region is, we can say and argue, is trending towards multipolarity, and this potentially mirrors the global picture of the current power distribution globally. Third finding is that the transactionalism is on the rise in the region, giving the three states more ability to engage with all outside powers and to reap the benefits of the still emerging global order. And this is also probably something that fits the global trend in which the middle and small powers are taking advantage of the emerging global distribution of power. So let me just now turn to how we got here over the decades. To do so, I will briefly address Russia's interests regarding the South Caucasus. So as we know, the literature on this is quite rich, but I decided to define this as Russia's core and non-core interests. So what I call Russia's core interests are two. The first one is more positive and the other one is more negative. The positive one means that Russia wanted all the three South Caucasus states to join its own security, political and economic institutions. And then the negative one is in relation to the West. At the same time, Russia did not want these countries to join the Western-led institutions of military, political and economic nature. There are also non-core interests that Russia has in relation to the region, and that includes economic, energy, and cultural ties with the region. But this is something, I argue, something that can be managed ad hoc and is sometimes based on the power realities of the day. So this is so to achieve its interests, Russia is using its military, political, and economic leverage in relation to the three countries. So I try to show that Russia, to what extent Russia was successful before the war and during the war in using this leverage to achieve its core and non-core interests in relation to these countries and in general. So I will just really briefly engage what was before the war in Ukraine, and then I will focus more on what's going on now. The rest of because the paper is quite lengthy in that regards. If you look at the paper, you will see quite big lengthy discussions on how Russia was building leverage before the war in Ukraine. So I mean, the finding is that before the war in Ukraine, Russia's sway sort of like on the region was never full, and it always depended on the time period and also on the country. That means that, and then here we can note that Russia's relations with Armenia in particular was sort of like an example of what Russia wanted from these countries. Russia wanted the South Caucasian states to be member of the all Russian-led institutions, starting from the CIS, CSTO, and Eurasian Economic Union. But it has achieved that, but Russia did not have and does not have Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia fully on board when it comes to having them as members of the all Russian-led institutions. And then also one thing that we have to note that throughout the period, Russia particularly had leverage due to its role in the conflicts in the South Caucasus, and then that leverage was strong on Armenia and Azerbaijan respectively, and also in relation to Georgia as well. So I will just briefly outline key moments prior to the war that impacted Russia's power in the region. The first one was 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia, which had the Western countries more present in the region, and then something that Russia did not like and found it as a threat. And second one was 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, and that when all the experts that I talked to and then pretty much everyone else agreed that this was a defining moment for Armenia and Azerbaijan in particular, in terms of understanding that going against Russia and moving closely to the West could be damaging for their respective interests. So the Western inaction in relation to Russian-Georgian war was seen as a call for Armenia and Azerbaijan to improve their ties with Azerbaijan. Also, the war was also something that made the EU's present, made the EU present institutionally in the region. As you know, the European Union's monitoring mission is in the region, and then also the Eastern Partnership Program was launched in 2008, which includes all the three South Caucasian countries, in addition to Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus also was there before. So another key moment was the 2013, 2014, when the association agreements were being signed with the European Union. Georgia has signed the agreement in 2014. Armenia wanted to sign the agreement, but was pressured by Russia not to do so. And instead, Armenia joined the Eurasian Economic Union at that time. So that period also made the EU more institutionally present in the region, as Georgia became more linked with the EU's system of governance, if you like. And then it also showed that Armenia had more sway on Armenia in terms of having Armenia also part of its Eurasian Economic Union. And then another important moment was the 2018 Velvet Revolution in Armenia, that Russia saw another color revolution and possibly the pathway for the West to come into the region strongly. However, the most important event for today's discussions, and then something that was foundational for the cracks in Russia's power in the South Caucasus, was the second Nagorno-Karabakh war in 2020. So even though initially it seemed like that Russia was a strong party in the region, because it was the only country that managed the ceasefire in 2020, and it also had its peacekeepers deployed in the region. But as the war's aftermath arguably showed that the Russia's relations with Armenia deteriorated, because Armenia found it that Russia, if you like, at the end of the day, sided with Azerbaijan over its treaty ally Armenia. So that made the relationship between Armenia and Russia deteriorate, while the relations with Azerbaijan kept improving. And that was demonstrated by the signature of the Allied Declaration on Interaction in February 2022. But when it comes to Georgia's role in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, there Georgia remained on the sidelines, trying to be neutral in the conflict, and was offering mediation, and that was it from the Georgian side. But already prior to the war in Ukraine, Azerbaijan started to test the extent to which it can go further in achieving its objectives fully, and then the extent to which it could test the waters in terms of violating the ceasefire agreement, and then also in relation to even though the Russian peacekeepers was there. So my understanding when I was reading about these issues was that even though the Ukraine war is important, the cracks in Russia's power in the South Caucasus actually starts from the Second Karabakh War and the following developments in the war. So that's a really important thing to know before assessing the impact of the Ukraine war. But what the Ukraine war did is that it accelerated already the trend that started before the war. So, and then that made, and then this was like, for me, one of the interesting points when having all the interviews with the experts was that many of them said that amid the war, now that the war in Ukraine has happened, the South Caucasus states could do things that they could not have imagined to do it before in relation to Russia. So the South Caucasus states have become more daring with Russia, and this was particularly the case in relation with Azerbaijan. That Azerbaijan started to incrementally achieve its objectives in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So I mean, the argument that the war about the war's impact is that the Russia's total focus on Ukraine and the Western economic sanctions placed on Russia as a result of the war against Ukraine has affected Russia's dominant position in the South Caucasus and its leveraging power over the three states. And then I will briefly try to demonstrate that in relation to the three countries, and but I mean, paper discusses that more in length. My argument is that in relation to Azerbaijan, Russia lost its upper hand. So if Azerbaijan was somehow dependent on Russia in relation to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict before, now that dependence is gone. And Azerbaijan even managed, and then something that was not anticipated when I was doing this research, is that the Azerbaijan has even managed to let the peacekeepers out before their departure dates in 2025. That showed that Azerbaijan is someone who is having the upper hand now in the relationship. That does not mean that the political relations have not improved. The political relations between Azerbaijan and Russia is underpinned by the authoritarianism and commitment to authoritarian power. So, and then relationship among them are mutually beneficial. But the important thing is that you can see that this in the statements coming from the leaders of the countries, that the two countries are really mindful of each other's red lines. So in that sense, the relationship is working between them. And then when I say red lines, is that, for instance, Azerbaijan never considers joining any Western institutions, and then that allows it to have good working relationship with Russia. And then also due to the Western sanctions, Azerbaijan's transit location and its natural resources definitely made it an important partner for Azerbaijan, and something that Azerbaijan cannot lose, cannot afford losing. So in relation to Azerbaijan, Russia's hand with Azerbaijan has weakened than before the war in Ukraine. With Armenia, Russia's hand weakened also there, but it still remains really strong country in the region. I mean, the nature of the relationship have been affected, particularly in the political domain. So the relationship between the ruling elites are really at their worst, and then some actions are taken by Armenia seems to be quite daring. For instance, its decision to freeze the participation in the CSTO, its decision to ratify the Rome Statute, even though that probably was not something to be directed at Russia, but still Russia saw that as a symbolic blow to its power in the region. There was also Armenia's decision to let the Russian border guards placed in the airport out of the country. That was also something that showed the worsening nature of the relationship between the two countries. And then also Armenia also started to have some ties with Ukraine, and which alienated Russia. There was meetings with Zelensky, between Pashinyan and Zelensky, and then was Armenian ambassador visited Bucha, which is the site of the war crimes committed by Russia. So these shows the tense in the political relationships between the ruling elites of the countries. In addition to that, Armenia is having its close security, political, and economic relations with the United States and the European Union. So the EU's civilian monitoring mission is in Armenia. Armenia has had the joint military exercises with the United States. So all of this shows that Russia is not happy with this, and this is something that you would not have before the war in Ukraine. But also, despite all these trends in worsening political relations, Armenia could not fully decouple from Russia in terms of the security, because of the absence of the alternatives. So, I mean, my understanding and my conclusion was that Armenia's best choice in terms of foreign policy alignment remains the multi-aligned foreign policy. It needs to engage with all outside powers just to make sure that the security is upheld and its internationally recognized borders are not violated by Azerbaijan or anyone else. So in that sense, Armenia currently does not have any trusted allies, so it needs to look for additional security partners, be it in the EU or United States, or also engaging with Iran. So in that sense, Armenia's foreign policy is quite multi-aligned. So when it comes to Georgia, things are more complicated than one would have expected. So I mean, in the paper, I framed this as Russian-Georgian relations as formal knowns and informal unknowns. So everything in Georgia is fine on the paper, but when it comes to the fine in a sense that Georgia is not formally aligned with Russia, it's not member of any Russian-led institutions. It is formally an EU candidate country. So in that sense, in a formal sense, everything seems fine in terms of Georgia's foreign policy orientation. But in practice, Georgia is economically engaging with Russia even more amid the war in Ukraine, and also its positioning on the Ukraine war favors gets praises from Russian leadership. So that's really something to look at. And then also Russia even abolished visa-free regime for Georgians that was in place since 2001, and also resumed direct flights it banned in 2019. So, I mean, in Georgia's case, the extent of the true relationship between the ruling parties and the ruling elites of the country is really hard to establish, to make a good analytical argument, because lots of formally you cannot really say much, because on paper everything looks nice. But I mean, we don't know the extent of the dynamics that are taking place informally between the leaders of the country. But because I mean, in Georgia, as you know, the people who are familiar with Georgia, is that no political party in Georgia wants direct association with Russia. That's electorally and politically costly. No one will say in public that we want to be member of the CIS or Russian-led institutions. So in Georgia, it's a very different context in which the things formally look nice, but some power dynamics as well as Russia's leveraging potential should be looked at in terms of the informal relations. But I mean, we cannot really establish what kind of informal relations are taking place between Georgian and Russian leaders. But I mean, in relation to Georgia, what we can say with certainty is that the ruling party's anti-democratic and anti-Western turn lately is favoring Moscow's interest and influence in general. So that's something. As long as in the paper, I argue that I say that as long as Georgia remains undemocratic, that's something that gives Russia leverage already, because that distances Georgia from its aspirations to join the Western countries. So now let me quickly and very briefly attend to how Russia's core interests in the region have been affected by the war in Ukraine. That I mean, as the fact, no South Caucasus states are members of the Western institutions. So in that sense, Russia is still having its core interests holding. But I mean, what we see is that Georgia is formally still a candidate country of the European Union, which gives the EU more presence in the region. And this is something, and it goes against the Russian desire to kick the West out of the region. And then also in relation to Armenia, which is formally still treaty ally of Russia, is voicing aspirations to join the European Union and improving ties with the European Union. So this is something which has not been before there in the region. So it is something that Russia needs to look at and take account of. And then also my understanding and finding was that because of the Western sanctions on Ukraine, on Russia, the Russia needs South Caucasian states more than these countries, I mean, more than before. So in that sense, in Russia's arsenal in the past, you always have seen the use of economic sanctions against the departing states, against the rebel states, as was the case in relation to Georgia. But I mean, we have not seen that use of that much economic sanctions against Armenia, for instance. So in that sense, Russia's ability to use the economic coercion to stop the political actions of the countries in the region has weakened overall. And then also the last thing that I really want to say is that in consensus with the unipolarity and multipolarity question of the region, so Russia is not has become just one among many players in the region. So geopolitically, Russia is strong and important, but so are the other countries. In relation to Turkey, Russia is becoming more dependent on Turkey in terms of the economic relations, and then due to the sanctions. the European Union and the United States have taken advantage of Russia's place in the region and have facilitated the talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan in terms of the coming to the conclusion of the peace treaty. And then, like I mentioned, the United States and the European Union hold different meetings with Armenia in terms of having agreed on the economic cooperation. So the other actors, including the EU and the United States, are entering. I mean, probably not that strongly, but are entering the region and are competing to Russia's interests there. And then also the fascinating thing is this China question that I really did not explore that much in the paper. But I mean, this is something because when I was writing the paper, Azerbaijan has not signed any strategic partnership with China before. Georgia did. But then the news came that the Azerbaijan also signed the strategic partnership with China and then probably expressing some interest in joining the BRICS. So the China is also there. But the question is to what extent that is threat to Russia, because China and Russia themselves are quite strong partners. But I would argue that individually, Russia as an individual actor is becoming weaker in the region. And then this could be, and this is like really arguably, and I really would like to hear what others are think on this, is that 3+3 format. So Russia's only pathway in the South Caucasus is always in relation to other powers like Turkey and Iran. So individually, Russia is not really strong to engage with all three countries at the same time. So it needs the broader platform through which to engage with the region. And to me, that's one of the signs of the weakening regional hegemon in the South Caucasus. And then I will just really quickly mention how the South Caucasus states themselves have become more daring and transactional in their relations with the outside world. And then here, what we have to say is that my understanding was that the non-Western as well as the Western countries have to appreciate more the local dynamics taking place in the countries and the choices that they are making. So in that sense, for instance, the Iran may not like Armenia engaging with the European Union and the United States, but that is something that is happening. In relation to Georgia, the Western countries may not like Georgia to be engaging with China, but that's something that is happening. And then the same has been true in relation to Azerbaijan before, because Azerbaijan was already multi-aligned in its foreign policy, but the multi-alignment is something which is probably spreading to Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. But I mean, here we have to have a caveat and say that many things depend on how things go in Armenia and Azerbaijan in terms of the domestic political development. So the elections and how they work out in Georgia in particular and in Armenia as well could have an impact on what kind of foreign policies that these countries are pursuing. So for instance, if the opposition victory happens in Georgia, then you will see more Western first approach in foreign policy, even though the Georgia's new opposition government would need to take into account the new realities of the region and engage with outside powers. So it's not, I mean, some sense of transactionality will remain there, but I mean, depends on who is in power in Armenia and Azerbaijan to see whether Georgia is coming back to the Western foreign policy or Armenia going back to pro-Russian foreign policy that we had seen before. So in that sense, I will just briefly conclude by saying that how things are turning in the region has implications for peace and security, trade and connectivity, democracy and geopolitical orientation. What we have seen, and there are some always the news is emerging in the region in the region regarding the peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So this is something that is not still within their reach, and then the extent to which this Russia's weakened position affected that, it is something to be discussed. In terms of democracy, the region is quite fragile. Azerbaijan is an authoritarian state, and Georgia and Armenia are electoral democracies. And then whether their autocratization continues or stays depends on the electoral results. And then the final thing is that the way the South Caucasus states are now looking in all directions of the geopolitical and geo-economic directions than before. So in the past, Armenia was solely looking at Russia, Georgia was Western, Azerbaijan doing balancing act between the two. But now all the countries, in my understanding, are engaging everyone to take their interests forward. So this is where I conclude my paper, and I really hope to convey the key things that I wanted to say, but you can find more in the paper, and I look forward to hearing your comments and engage in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irakli. I have put the link to Irakli's paper into the chat, so you can open that and dig deeper, but we can also do that in the course of our discussion. We have 1 hour still for that today. So if you have any questions, any comments, please do put them into the Q&A box. But before going to the questions from the audience, I would like to give the floor to our commentators. Olesya, would you maybe start?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, I will be speaking from a point of view of a practitioner, of a person who has been talking to all different actors, both here in the region, but also outside, including in Russia. Congratulations, Irakli. It's quite a challenge, I should say, when you have to take a topic or the issue that is still developing, because we, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine, Russia continues it, and then we don't really see how it's going to end. And I should say that with ambiguity exactly is something that contributes to much anxiety and also many developments that we are probably going to see and then have seen so far. From a practitioner point of view, I would probably have to emphasize something that I often observe in academic papers is when people are discussing a regional power, an important actor, and then its interests and also actions, how the impact of its policies, but they don't really pay much attention to the agency of the local actors. And then the local actors, in that sense, we are talking about of course, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And then these countries, they have gone through a very important period of development, right? I mean, and then throughout this period of over 30 years, or since their independence, regained independence, what we have been observing is actually, especially, I would say, I would claim during in the last 50 years, is their desire to self-establish their own interests and then to promote them. And I should say that when it comes to, especially to countries like Azerbaijan, it is more than visible, right? I mean, and for sure, South Caucasus is now really very crowded. We have not only China, or Turkey, or Iran, we actually have even countries like, for example, India, also with its interest. We see Pakistan, we see some others, and I think it's not by chance. But if you look at the region itself and how it has been developing so far, it's certainly the choices that are made by Tbilisi, by Baku, and by Yerevan that are dictating the developments. And they also, I think it's really very important in a way to find kind of, to analyze how the policies are developing, not only through the prism of Moscow's interests. It's actually the states, the countries in this very region that are making the choices. And then that choices, they can be dictated by different reasons, right? So one of them is, of course, the desire of certain leadership to stay in power, or there can be also an economic interest in terms of kind of increasing in incomes, hopefully to their populations, but sometimes it's not only the only rational, but there can be also, and then with this kind of, one school of thought, which is about development of national identity, or kind of, with nation building, one would claim, with all the everything that has happened to this region, not only since the 90s, but also even before that. I mean, and then these are certainly the things that are dictating many of the choices, and then including in their relations with Russia and then some other actors. If you ask me, again, kind of from a perspective of an observer, what has been happening in the very region, I would say that it's in fact less about being kind of the tendency for multipolarity. I would say that what has been happening, especially in the last couple of years, it's a strong strive of Azerbaijan to build a leadership in the region. And then so far, we have been seeing how Azerbaijan has been succeeding. One would claim that that kind of traction basically started even before the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and for sure, the economic wealth and the presence of Azerbaijan, for example, in Georgia, I'm speaking to you from my home country, from Tbilisi. When you travel to Zugdidi and there you see SOCAR distributing the gas to the local population, that should probably tell kind of, to an outside observer, the level, basically the presence of Azerbaijan and then of Azerbaijani interests, in that sense. And for those who might not know, SOCAR is a state-run company in this country, so in Azerbaijan. So I would kind of probably want to emphasize this very thing. And then, just kind of to conclude on that very point, it's really very interesting that we have Armenia and Georgia both going through the revolutions. And for Georgia, it was 2003. For Armenia, it was 2018. And it's interesting that both countries, in the very beginning, what they have been doing is they were trying to fix their relations with Russia. And then you might remember this period when, for example, the freshly elected new president of Georgia, the first thing that he did is he traveled to Moscow. And then he started, we all heard all these different stories about him swimming in a swimming pool for too long and being late for the meeting with Vladimir Putin. But there were some attempts made by the Georgian leadership, including after the revolution, that seemed to be not very favored, to put it kind of in diplomatic way, in Russia, still to avoid any kind of conflict and to somehow go towards a compromise. It fell to the point where Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. What actually happened with Armenia is for a long time, and I would say that even the current Armenian leadership in the last 5 years has made so many attempts to fix its relations with Russia. And then I had to hear so many people complaining during different periods. You might remember that it even happened after the 2020 war, when Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, he went to Moscow, he agreed to certain things that that now from today's perspective seem really very strange. For example, he agreed to the deployment of the Russian border guards along the Armenian-Azerbaijan border. Now we have a process when Armenia is actually, he is asking the Russian border guards to leave even the airport, or some other, issues. Of course, one would argue that that's kind of, that Armenia had no other choice and it had to to take care of its own security, the fact that it lost its army in the 2020 war. But I would say that it's still significant, and then it's really interesting in that sense, how much these countries tend to keep a hope that they are able to make a deal with Moscow. I'm not even talking about the current Georgian leadership in that sense. We can discuss it later if you want. But from the Russian perspective, what's really very interesting, what I have been hearing, right? From the Russian officials and Russian academics is for sure they treat South Caucasus as part of their backyard. They don't want to see anyone, no matter what, no matter whether this is the West or anyone else, to get here, to the point when you even meet the people who might start talking about a possible kind of new Soviet Union that would include maybe not all three, but at least some parts of the South Caucasus. It's interesting that in that sense, what I have been hearing in my conversation is that many of with officials or like the thinkers, you know, they're in Moscow, that they consider 2008 being a mistake from Moscow, you know. And I think that's so, I mean, it's not that Russia is so much sorry about all the death and all the displacement that it brought with itself, but it's actually the fact that by invading Georgia and then by recognizing Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they got two territories that they cannot really trade, you know, with anyone. But on the other hand, they lost Georgia. And I have been seeing and then hearing, you know, with sentiment related to the 2008 war so many times after that. Like, for example, you know, like before the 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh, or even after that, when discussing why Russia acted this way, you know, why it didn't really try to do more to protect Armenia. What they were saying is that we learned the lesson of the 2008 war. We don't want to lose another South Caucasian country. It's Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is too important for us. It's too big. And then it's in that sense, it's definitely not a decision that we will take. And then, of course, there can be some other reasons and sentiments, but it's really very interesting that in that sense, it's kind of, you know, Russia that would want, absolutely feels a monopoly here, and then whatever sharing they might be, you know, kind of some sharing that might be happening. I mean, you emphasize what they have with Turkey, for example, or maybe potentially we don't see that much yet, but with China, I would say that there were the moments when we saw Russia sharing even with the West, when it was to its interest, right? I mean, like, for example, even like what was happening with some of the mediation before the 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh. We all kind of, you know, there were some Russian analysts who would say that, oh, that the Minsk, OSCE Minsk group is the one that is kind of, you know, brought together the West and then Russian representatives, and they cooperated. It's like the only format. I mean, we all know that it was Russia that was leading the group, and then the others were just subscribing to what it was doing. I mean, to not everything, but to a big extent, it was still Russia, especially during the last, I would say, 15 years. So, I mean, I would say that from the Russian perspective, this region is definitely a backyard. It's gonna stay like this, and whatever is happening right now in terms of like so many flags, so many visits, and it's all temporary. And then I can tell you that when it's really interesting when you see the same sentiments coming from, including from some very pro-Western officials here in the South Caucasus, and I will not even name the country, who would say that we saw that Russia was really very weak in the 90s. We made use of it but then Russia came back. And then it brought back, I mean, and then what we got is even worse. I mean, in that sense, from a sovereignty point of view. And I would add on something that you mentioned as well, Irakli, and I strongly agree with it. This is where I started as well. You know, it's really very interesting and it's striking when you speak, for example, to the Russian officials, not to mention other foreign officials, and then discussing the rationale or what's happening here or the choices that the South Caucasian countries are making without properly understanding the stance of both the leaderships, but also publics and what's driving, you know, their decisions. To me, like one example of that was a very senior Russian official who started asking me about the 2018 revolution in Armenia, whether is it true, he was asking, is it true that publics were protesting the poor governance in Armenia? It was not like he was asking, like, you know, he was looking for some Western meddling in the process. But to me, it was really interesting that even the guy who is working in Armenia 24/7, he doesn't understand that some of these processes, they can be really very locally generated, yeah, and then there are the things that are not really cannot be really dictated but from outside. And in that sense, of course, you would want to some other foreign actors to be more sensitive, more open to understanding the local rationale, and also supporting. I would say that still most of the Western countries, we don't know who will be the next president in the US, but still they are the ones who are showing the strive towards the freedom and also support to the statehood, building the democracies. I think this is something that still finds attraction, maybe not with all the leaderships, but with the people who are looking for a better and better life and more justice, I would say, and more opportunities for their future generations. But of course, even in that sense, I would say that the key Western institutions, they have things to learn. And unfortunately, what we have been observing in many cases is reactive policies rather than proactive planning. And then you mentioned one of them, like, for example, establishing the Eastern Partnership only after the 2008 war, and then not really or for example, the current situation with Armenia, that is desperate to get at least a hint that the European Union is interested to process, to enter the process, and then we don't really see it happening. So I would probably stop here, and then again, thank you so much for all your work that you did. It's fascinating that we have an organization that are supporting the research, especially in this region. Unfortunately, we have been seeing a decline, I would say, in support to such work. So I think it's really very important in that sense to support and then to to be grateful for the work that Irakli did.
Thank you very much, Olesya, and also thank you for your support towards our program by being here. In your contribution, you emphasized the importance and role of local agency, and I think that is something that we may want to come back to, and Irakli might want to later on comment on. But before we go there, I also want to give the floor to Laurence to share his reflections.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Irakli, and congratulations on a great piece of work. As a veteran of writing pieces about the South Caucasus, it is often, because as Olesya said, it is such a crowded region, one can end up with quite chaotic texts trying to cover all the different dyadic relationships in the region. And I think your paper does an admirable job of navigating what is this incredibly fluid festival of multivectoralism, if I could put it that way. The paper is extremely well written. It is a model of clarity. And so congratulations to you as author, and I'm sure that the paper will find a wide audience. Now, with that said, I have a few comments, which I think take various points in the paper as a springboard into other possible directions that could be taken up in future research and discussion. First of all, I'm not completely convinced by the framing of the first 3 decades of the post-Soviet period as a unipolar moment for Russia. I think this ascribes too much power and centrality to Russia over this period, and it risks, in my view, a kind of equation between a Russian unipolar moment in the South Caucasus and an American unipolar moment in the world. And I think this might be not necessarily helpful for a couple of reasons. It implies a kind of similarity in the origins and legitimation of unipolarity. But I think there are important analytical and empirical distinctions to be made between the unipolarity stemming from global dominance based on the supposed hegemony and superiority of a particular economic and political order, capitalist liberal democracy, and the regional dominance afforded to a former colonial power center by a wide range of linkages stemming from its former rule over the region, but which has no widely recognized claim for its models of political or economic order. And secondly, if we talk about a Russian unipolar moment in the South Caucasus, how would we then understand the position of the South Caucasus vis-à-vis the American unipolar moment in the world? How could the region participate simultaneously in two unipolar moments? And I say that as someone who wrote an article after the Second Karabakh War entitled Requiem for the Unipolar Moment. And I actually had in mind the Western unipolar moment. So in a way, I think we see the end of two unipolar moments through these events of the past 4 years or so. And so, yeah, that's a kind of a different lens through which to look at this. And there's a certain tension there, I think, that then comes out. So, for instance, in one of your sections, you're talking about building leverage between 1991 and 2007 for Russia. But actually, I would see it more as a struggle to uphold reserves of leverage against the outside unlinkedness coming in. So that's one set of points. Another prism and another question for me, I wondered whether there's too much emphasis in the paper on the extent of Russia's hegemony or domination on a scale from strong to weak, rather than an emphasis on change in the institutions, mechanisms, levers, and modus of Russia's influence. And I think this is in part due to there's a dissonance in the paper between a chronological principle of organizing the text and a thematic one. So, the first part of the text is taken up with these examinations of these different periods, and later in the conclusions, we see a more thematic principle of organizing the text into subsections on peace and security, democracy, trade and connectivity, and so on. And I wonder whether future analysis could try to disaggregate and define different types of power and different types of linkage, and how the dynamics within each of these fields of power is unfolding. And yeah, this might offer a bit more clarity rather than at times there are rather vague notions of building or consolidating leverage, and it would help us to understand shifts in the basis for Russian power and influence. I think this ties into, you addressed it very clearly in your presentation just now, but one gets always a very strong sense of Russia's negative goals, the things that Russia wants to prevent from happening. But it's that much harder, I think, to define positive goals that Russia is seeking to pursue. So we have, I think there is a useful distinction between Russia's efforts to contain a liberal political order and its efforts to construct an alternative order. And this is a particularly important distinction, it seems to me, for the South Caucasus, because in the western parts of the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine and Moldova, it is much more about containment of a liberal order. Whereas in Central Asia, it's much more about building the basis for an alternative order, to some extent in partnership with China. Whereas in the South Caucasus, we're really at the midpoint in Eurasia, where these two different sets of goals kind of come into conflict within the same region. And one aspect to this, which I felt perhaps could have been covered more, and I'd be interested in your perspectives. Are we seeing an end to, or where do we stand with Russian soft power and soft power appeals? Russia's entry points and levers at the level of civil society, and producing a loyal civil society, a conservative civil society, working with those elements in local civil societies that do share values. So that would be, I think, an interesting sort of a next stage to look at. And then finally, my final sort of set of comments. I wondered about this because your paper, in a way, it's looking at the end of the unipolar moment, but it also takes a rather unipolar framework of analysis of Russia's relations with the three regional states. And I think that's legitimate and reasonable. I think we all do it when we're writing about, Turkey's relations with the three states, the West's relations with the three states, and so on. I wonder, though, how useful and how viable and how justified this unipolar framework of analysis can be, and how long can we still do that? Because if there's one thing that we've learned since 2020, it's that we have to account for meso-level actors, if I could put it that way. Most importantly, we need to account for the role of Middle Eastern actors, Turkey, Iran, Israel, whose presence and influence in the region are instrumental to the end of any unipolar moment. And of course, to cover those actors, actions and influences would be another whole paper in itself. But I wonder if we could, for the future, think of a more complex incorporation of both regional state perspectives, meso-level powers in a more complex multi-tier analysis of not only decline, but transformation in Russian power, since Russia is the focus here. And that's important because, as Olesya also highlighted, when we look at Russia's interactions with Turkey and Iran, we don't see a one-way street in terms of power hierarchies. We see ways in which these states are sometimes successfully working together. And so that brings us to a new stage in the analysis, one that moves on from an end to a Russian unipolar moment or a Western unipolar moment, to one in which we look at how these outside powers are engaging with, trying to manage, and trying to center themselves in this multipolar world that we're now living in. So I will stop there so that we have time for questions. Many thanks again, and congratulations on a great paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. And also thank you for my role as a moderator, because you just made my life so much more easier by raising so many interesting questions and comments. So I think Irakli has quite a good set of issues to tackle straight out. And while he does that, I would like to encourage our audience to put your questions and comments into the Q&A box, and we will be picking those up in the next round of the discussion. Irakli, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your feedback and inputs. And then, honestly, I probably do not have that much to say, because I do subscribe to many feedbacks and criticisms voiced, and then also the comments raised. One thing that I would say is the nature of the paper and the policy paper. So this is probably more into the domains of the policy paper rather than, for instance, the academic article or the book, which would be really good in terms of covering all the actors and then staying away from Russia and having the interests of Turkey and Iran and then Pakistan and India as well, and Israel, and then how those relationships are untangled, and then the relations between Azerbaijan and Turkey. Definitely, there are lots of things to do, but the fellowship and the way the policy paper had to come out, scope is definitely limited. So in that sense, there is that. And also, but I personally found interest in researching Russia. That's why it's unipolar vis-à-vis Russia. So, and I really wanted to make sense of how Russia is doing in the region in terms of its position in the region. But certainly other actors are really important to know, especially Turkey, Iran, and then China now and others. But on your point, on Laurence's point on unipolarity. So I agree with that. that brought the connotations which probably invites the reader to go into the US-led unipolarity. So in that sense, there is that. But my understanding of titling this was simply just to indicate that the moment of dominance, which was there at some point over the decades, and then it was the first among the equals, if you like, in terms of the regional actors. And then Olesya mentioned in her contributions that, for instance, the Minsk group, and then the way it was composed, it gave you a sense of multipolarity and then different actors being there and playing a role. But objectively, Russia was the actor to take account of. So in that sense, the unipolarity means, the way I decided to frame it is that Russia is not the sole actor in the region, and there are other actors that we had to analyze, like you mentioned. So, and then who are they having interest, and then things are being redefined now. But I do also agree in terms of going into how in parallel the global and regional order is unfolding, in a sense of the US unipolarity coming to an end. And then, some authors even argue that we are not in a multipolarity and we are now in a bipolarity. So in that sense, there are lots of things to discuss on a global level. But when I was working on this and reading and talking to people, it gave me sense that what's happening there, it sort of like mirrors what's happening on the global level in terms of the emerging distribution of power. So this is definitely not to analytically conflate the regional dimension of the analysis and the global dimensions analysis, because they are the separate ones and then require different look. But in terms of the capturing the moment of how Russia is doing in the region, that the unipolarity was something that was that I thought applies to it. So that's why it is there. But definitely it's interesting how Russia is placed within that multipolar regional distribution. And then in terms of your comments on capitalism and things, Russia itself, some academics argue, is the subaltern empire, right? So within the capitalist state of power. So in that sense, there are lots of the sub dimensions of things. But the unipolarity was just to simply indicate that what changed after the war in Ukraine, and then what started in my opinion in the Second Karabakh War, but accelerated by Russia's total focus on Ukraine, was that the different actors are now more important. And that brings me to your comments to Laurence's comment on how, for instance, Russia and Iran are codependent on each other in terms of supporting each other. Like, for instance, Iran supporting Russia in Ukraine, but also Russia committing to support Iran in relation to Israel. So in that kind of sense, there is codependency among the actors. There is huge codependency between China and Russia. And then for the future research, in my opinion, that's something to explore. How serious is this? Is there going to be some sort of the Central Asian model of competition and cooperation to be imported in the South Caucasus, in a sense of because these are the huge issues are there. Then I do agree to conclude this section by Olesya's point on the local agency. I do subscribe to the idea in terms of the international relation theory as well, that the determinist understanding of the international relation is not something to go for it. Simplicity is sometimes good and parsimony is good, but you have to untangle different variables affecting decision making. So in that sense, it's not only Russia that is dictating the trends in the South Caucasus. It's the actors themselves and the political parties and the individuals making decisions about things and then these decisions come into play and then interact with different levels of governance. So in that sense, the local agency is important. That's why my understanding was that because of the weakened Russia, in a sense, the three countries are now more daring in terms of the engagement with the old power. So there is some appreciation of their local agency, but to what extent that is the case, we are going to see that. So I think I'll conclude here.
Thank you very much, Irakli, and thank you to all panelists for their contributions to the discussion. We have already a couple questions in the Q&A, and again, I would just like to encourage our audience to share your questions with us. Before going there, I would like to just push you a little bit on the issue of multipolarity and multivectoralism and how it plays out in the South Caucasus, especially in the context that you are discussing, that this unipolar moment, as you put it, Irakli, of Russia is now over. So I think for the sake of our understanding, it would be important to dive a little bit deeper on the various actors that are present in the region. On the one hand, so how are actors like Turkey, China, the EU, the United States are grasping, if at all, this moment in the South Caucasus? How are they reacting, or potentially, in some cases, maybe driving the shift in the region, on the one hand? And since we were talking also about the importance of local agency, I would also like to ask you how you see such powers through the lens of the three countries. So what can these actors offer the three countries in the region in the relative absence? Maybe that would be a stretch, but in the context where Russia's powers positions are weakening. So how do the local actors benefit from other regional powers, and how do other powers use this new dynamic on the ground? And the question would go to all of you.
Should I start first?
Please.
So I mean, in terms of how the different actors are grasping the sort of like the new reality that is in the region, is that, like, for instance, this is like the Olesya mentioned this in the beginning, this is still unfolding. The events are still unfolding. So many things are still, we are going to see and witness how things are going to develop in the future. And then some things are coming on the way. For instance, I read the news that Turkey is officially applying to join the BRICS, for instance, and then Azerbaijan signed the strategic partnership, and Georgia has signed the strategic partnership with China. So, I mean, in terms of, so there is sort of like the unpredictability of things to look at. But my argument in the paper, what I was saying is that, in particular for the EU and the United States, the weakened Russia does not automatically means that their interests are going to be implemented in the region. And then, like Olesya mentioned, they have to be more proactive in terms of offering, taking advantage of, if you like, the power gap. They have done that to some extent. For instance, one could see the EU's presence in the EU civilian monitoring mission being present in Armenia can be indication of that. That the European Union is interested to be in there, and then taking sort of like the advantage of the power gap in the region. The United States and then the EU have contributed to the peace mediation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So there is something that they are taking advantage of. But I mean, they have signed, like I mentioned in the presentation, they have signed some cooperation agreements on range of issues, starting from economy, building civilian nuclear plant, and things like that. So the cooperation is taking place, especially from the EU and the US side. In terms of China, for instance, my paper, I mean, China has more ties, it seems, with Georgia and Azerbaijan than with Armenia, for instance. So China seems to be less interested in having more ties with Armenia. So in that sense, and Turkey, in terms of Turkey, it's complicated, because I mean, my finding and understanding was that some outside powers are struggling to engage with all at the same time. So that gives some limitations to them in terms of exercising their power. For instance, Turkey could not have the full-fledged relationship with Armenia because the normalization process is not taking on, etc. So in that sense, I would say the EU and the US is taking some advantage of the things, but they, I mean, when Olesya mentioned this in relation to the Armenia's EU membership, what I have read is that government is saying that we are interested to join the EU as long as the European Union is interested to take us in. So in that sense, there is lack of proactivity from the European Union side in terms of enlarging into Armenia now. But I mean, that was problem before the war in Ukraine, because the enlargement was not on the agenda toward the South Caucasus, but the war in Ukraine has made that possible. So in that sense, some outside powers are making sense of that, especially the EU and the United States, but so is China. So I mean, in my paper, I say this, that the choices, if you like really have black and white framing, you can say that the choices for the South Caucasus states are democratic powers and the authoritarian powers competing for different regions of orders, and then how the local dynamics unfold will define the directions of each country. For instance, in case of Georgia, it's really the test case of where Georgia is going to go and then that depends hugely on the elections that is coming up in October. And then also in relation to Armenia, the elections are in 2026. So on the side of Azerbaijan, we see more certainty, but I mean, in terms of how the two countries in particular engage with the outside world depends so much on the developments within them. So I will just...
Alessia, Laurence, would you like to add anything?
Yes, absolutely. With three countries, and I would say not only three countries, but also, for example, the occupied territories, I'm talking about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Nagorno-Karabakh that ceased its existence last year. They all entered with period of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in different situations, and then their responses and their kind of decisions so far, they have been dictated, I would say, again through they were dictated basically what's is at stake for them, what kind of interest they have, and in that sense, I mean, I would say that Armenia is clearly kind of, and you can hear it, the officials, and some of them even speaking on the record now. Yeah, I mean, saying that their biggest fear when the invasion started, it was that the war will be very quick, and then Armenia will be forced to join the new something, I mean, a new union, and then in that sense, I mean, we can say that Armenia's actions, they have been mainly dictated by with strive, to somehow sustain its statehood. I would say that it's also Armenia's weakness and then desire to somehow take at least a break in its continuous conflict with Azerbaijan, because I mean the problems that Armenia got as a result of the 2020 war, I mean, they were well present even before the Russian invasion. There were border incidents that were taking place, and I should say that, in fact, the first meetings mediated by the European Union, they took place before the invasion. So that kind of also this is something probably to take into account in terms of kind of when thinking about the choices that, for example, this very country is making. And then Georgia, look, I mean, of course, there can be different rationale and then different interests there, but I mean, it's clear that the Georgian ruling party, Georgia Dream, it has been having the problems with kind of sustaining, or not to mention gaining popularity in its own population. Every next election has been more difficult for them, even before the invasion. And then right now, I mean, everyone is getting kind of bored, they want to change. And of course, the Georgian Dream entered with period of the Russian invasion with its key challenge of staying in power. And then it continues, and I would say growing conflict at that point with the West, that has been asking to implement some of the reforms that could eventually contribute to the Georgian dream losing, the elections. And Azerbaijan, look, I mean, I think Azerbaijan has been in the most favorite, I would say, situation. I remember having a conversation with one Azerbaijani colleague when the invasion just started, and then that was basically kind of the conclusion that we reached, is that Azerbaijan will become even more and a demand, both from the side of Russia, but also from the West and other actors. And this is what has been happening so far. Yeah, I mean, we see that Azerbaijan has been reinforcing its positions diplomatically, politically. I mean, some of the action that has taken place in the last 2 years, now a bit more, in terms of the situation with Nagorno-Karabakh, in terms of also Azerbaijan's relations with Armenia, Azerbaijan's whole stance, I would say, in the region. It reflects very much, again, how Azerbaijan entered this period and how it has been, one would say, exploding, but basically kind of using this very space that it got. And I will probably not I will only in 2 words say that, well, unfortunately, those who were dependent on Russia before the invasion, they seem to have even smaller space now in terms of the engagement. And I'm talking about, of course, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, which are recognized by Russia. And then we can see how the whole conversation is more about making use of these territories against something, either the West or someone else, and then how much the space for them has shrunk in terms of engagement with other actors, not only Russia. I mean, the kind of one would kind of call it black and white world, where there is a very small space for different colors, and then of course, I mean, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, if there were anyone ready to recognize their agency and interest, there is much less space to argue for that and to discuss that. As a practitioner, I think we will still have to return to some of the discussion, later on. Hopefully, that will not be provoked by any kind of conflicts, and then it would rather be kind of, a continuation of the discussion of how to resolve the conflict peacefully.
Thank you, Olesya. Laurence?
Yeah, I'll just quickly pick up on a couple of things. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It is those South Caucasus actors that were most bought into, out of choice or not, bloc politics that have lost out, and that have seen their room contract. And Azerbaijan's foreign policy was, if anything, contrapolar before. It was, about maintaining as many relationships, friendly relations in as many directions as possible, avoiding bloc politics. And so Azerbaijan, I think, was in the strongest position to take advantage of this fractured context, and fully agree with what Olesya was saying. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what I think is an implicit tension in the conclusions to the paper, and in a sense, the most interesting sentence. When you juxtapose the increasing transactionalism being exercised by the regional states now that they're able to balance multivectoralism and so on, but the ultimate geopolitical choice is between authoritarian and democratic powers. Now, there's a lot of truth in that, but I think it's not only a geopolitical choice, it is a political choice, and it is about how you generate legitimacy, how you exercise power. Whether your political strategy is based on resources, actors, sources of support outside of your own society, or within your own society. And I think what we're seeing is the emergence of a particular type of political leadership that specializes in balancing between various sources of external support and various sources of rents. And I think this is a specific quality of South Caucasus geopolitics, is the way in which these states extract locational rents from outside powers, which I think goes to the heart of the analysis in your paper. And I think there are very interesting comparisons to be made, for example, with Afghanistan as a state that whose leading regimes were basically able to monetize and convert locational importance and geostrategic importance to various outside powers into resources for rule. TV Paul talks about Pakistan's geostrategic curse, how Pakistan's location has enabled its regime to basically generate all sorts of external rents and sustain power. So there is an internal dimension to this, and this persistent rent-seeking strategy in the South Caucasus clashes with the reality of the history of mass mobilization for participatory politics. These are countries that have experience in the early 20th century of independence as parliamentary democracies, and then went through these mass mobilizations in the 90s. And then we've seen, whether successful or unsuccessful, a variety of color, velvet, and failed revolutions. And so this is kind of where I see the heart of the region's politics, is this contest between a recursive, really grounded public demand for political participation and the potential to rule and impose an authoritarian way of ruling through the extraction of different rents from both domestically in terms of natural resource rents, but externally through the kind of geopolitics that we've been discussing. So that tension for me is what makes me pessimistic about a stabilization of the region. I think we will continue to see regional fracture, and I think a future angle of research, and something that I hope to look into in the future, is this notion of strategic triangles, and how you have basically the South Caucasus, you have a series of nested strategic triangles, and it's how these triangles basically interact with each other and are very fragile and liable to collapse like Jenga, but also can constitute a kind of very diffuse provisional stability. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Irakli, I would like to give you the chance to react if you wish, but also to pick up on one of the questions, and you mentioned that regarding future foreign policy orientation, internal dynamics matter a lot, and we have a question regarding the upcoming Georgian elections. So apart from the outcome influencing the orientation of the country, what are your expectations regarding the election outcome, and Russia's potential influence on the elections?
Thank you very much. I really subscribe to what Laurence and Olesya and their comments, but I mean, I will definitely agree and stress how still the mode of governance is not entirely dictated by the outside framework, but I mean, the local actors themselves are generating different kinds of ways of ruling. So they are probably learning from someone else, like, for instance, the Georgian government adopting the foreign agent legislation. I mean, that is something that they are learning from someone else, but I mean, they also do have their own interests, as you mentioned, to, if you like, kill the participatory politics and democracy, which then requires exercising different kinds of power. So I mean, again, we are going back to the point that the local dimensions do matter, particularly in the countries that are still democracies, at least the electoral ones. And as we know, Armenia and Georgia are not consolidated democracies, so they are the electoral democracies, and they have still they can still go both ways. They could go autocratizing, or they could go towards democracy consolidation. And then that's why the Georgian election is important in that regard, to which direction the Georgian elections and then its result is going to take the country. I mean, in terms of the Russia's role, is that, I mean, we only see the statements coming from them. So what we see is that the Georgian ruling party have adopted the increasingly anti-Western narrative and discourse in relation in their foreign policy. Like, for instance, we all have heard the Global War Party, and then they also picked up on this famous Russian trope that these countries do not have agencies but are directed and given directions coming from the West. So these countries are sort of like puppets of the West in that sense. So, and then the Georgian ruling party has made this point that, for instance, the Rose Revolution in 2003 was imposed on Georgians. It was not the choice by the Georgians themselves. So in that sense, we see huge uniformity of the ruling Georgian Dreams discourses, and then the Russian reactions to it. And then there was a statement from the Russian institution that agreeing the Georgian Dream that the US is planning another color revolution in Georgia. So that was the key point of that statement. And this is something that the Georgian leaders themselves are saying. So in that sense, we, like I said, formally it's really hard to establish the links, but I mean, they are helping hand is there coming from Russia in terms of the statement. But I mean, in terms of the results, I mean, honestly, I do not know. And then, Georgian politics can surprise. And then we had in 2012, that kind of surprise was taking place, because at that time, Georgian politics was also autocratizing. So it was not the example of best democracy. It was the same kind of one-party dominance leading to the authoritarianism. And then the 2012 was the time when the Georgian public, because of the different factors, like the Ivanishvili's money was the huge thing in terms of playing the role there. But I mean, the Georgian polity in general could deliver surprises. So we cannot completely exclude that the same kind of surprise is going to happen these elections. And then I will just say, and then let the Olesya add, is that my own personal observation is that in terms of the electoral statistics, the Georgian Dream has not had the majority since 2012. So they never got the over 50% in their electoral results. They got the 55%, if I am correct, in 2012. Since then, they are on the verge of the majority. So in that sense, statistically speaking, it's really hard for them to even get the simple majority, not to mention the constitutional majority that they really want to have. So in that sense, I mean, it's still fragile. But I mean, what I will say is that in terms of foreign policy orientation, if this government, the ruling party, stays, I expect the rise of transactionalism to continue, and then sort of like the rent-seeking foreign policy is going to be the order of the day. But if the opposition comes in power, and then in Georgian context, that's the coalitional politics similar to the Europeans, because no opposition party has a single majority, so they have to cooperate, right? So in that sense, my expectation is that their default orientation will be Western, but then trade-offs will be made with the other powers depending how the relationship will go. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Irakli. And as we are approaching the very end of our allocated time, I would just like to give one more minute both to Olesya and Laurence to share some final thoughts. And then we unfortunately have to close this very interesting discussion.
Well, I will be very brief. Thanks again for writing the paper. Thanks for supporting it. And also great to be here with you. I think the Georgian elections, I agree with Irakli that the Georgian public can surprise in that sense. I mean, of course, the Georgian public is not the only one, but I think what we really need to pay attention, and then that's probably where I would put a different hat of a person who has been working on the conflicts, is definitely we need to continue watching what will be happening with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because if, for example, especially in during the upcoming voting and the events, if something starts happening there, that will definitely have an impact on the Georgian processes. And then we all understand that if something happens there, there definitely will be some speculations or maybe even the evidence-based claims that the Russian presence and kind of Russian government is interested to activate things like this. If Georgia Dream stays in power, I think we will be seeing less presence and engagement of the Western actors, and then that will have a dramatic and then the tremendous effect on everything that has to do with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And if opposition comes to power, I think what we will be having in the longer term, at least kind of a perspective, there will be some issues since both Moscow but also the de facto authorities, they support the Georgian Dream, the ruling party. So I definitely kind of, we need to keep our fingers crossed, and let's hope how it goes. It will be very, very crucial and then very important, in fact, at this very moment for the European Union, first of all, but also for the United States to support these very processes in Georgia through their engagements, and also all the tools that have been in place since 2008 war, so that we actually have a bigger chance to keep a stability, and then to allow the Georgian voters to somehow express their vote, you know, and then get the government that they want to see ruling this country without any kind of interference.
Thank you very much, Olesya. And Laurence, on to final words to you. You are muted, and just to maybe situate it a little bit, I was wondering if you could also maybe share some thoughts to conclude on how you think the war affects Russia's impact also beyond the region of the South Caucasus.
Well, that's, I think, taking me out of my area, so I probably won't comment on that as such. I'll probably finish instead on something that I do know a bit more about, which is the Armenian-Azerbaijani peace talks. This is another key issue, obviously, to keep an eye on, that has huge implications. 30 years we've been waiting for a regional opening, and it seems so near and yet so far. My sense, and this is just my perception, so many of the issues that divided Armenians and Azerbaijanis have been decided by force. What's left on the agenda is a very truncated set of issues. And I wonder whether there's a dynamic of negotiating for diminishing returns effectively. When you're in a position of dominance, you're negotiating an agreement. Most of the key issues have been resolved. I think there's a temptation to start adding in new issues and to go for a maximalist approach. And I am concerned that we do see a kind of a growing list of items that are mentioned as preconditions, whether that is changes to the Armenian constitution, Armenian cooperation in the dissolution of OSCE mediation architecture, restrictions on the Armenian army, recent comments on withdrawal of the EU mission to Armenia. Now, there's nothing necessarily unusual about revising legislation or retiring obsolete mediation architecture in a situation where there has been a definitive move towards a transformation of relations. all things can be on the table. But what worries me is that we do still see many of those same conflict narratives and conflict tropes and symbols, the enemy image and so on, are still very much in circulation. And so I think it's critical that outside actors keep a close eye on this process, even though they have been, to all intents and purposes, removed from direct mediation, and there's pros and cons to that. But there's an awful lot hanging on this in terms of the future of the region and the potential for growing lateral ties amongst the region's actors that could, in a hypothetical future, reduce the significance of geopolitical leverage coming from outside, which has been the topic of Irakli's paper and our discussion today. So thank you very much, Zsuzsanna. Thank you, Irakli. Thank you, Olesya, for this discussion. And I'm looking forward to disseminating the paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurence, Olesya, and of course, thank you very much, Irakli. I have shared the link to Irakli's paper in the chat, and I hope you will find it useful and interesting. We are very happy that we have had Irakli as one of our ReThink.CEE fellows over the past year. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you, Irakli, and I wish you all the very best for the next chapters in your career. I would like to thank also our audience for joining us today, and I would like to encourage you to follow our work on Twitter, X, Facebook, and to subscribe to our mailing list to receive our invitations for our upcoming events. Over the next months, we will have several other ReThink.CEE fellows finishing their fellowship with us. So we will have topics covering veteran reintegration in Ukraine. We have also a different angle on, for example, refugees and the impact of war on Ukrainians in Central and Eastern Europe. So please stay with us and follow our work. Those of you who are under 35 in the audience, I encourage you to apply for our ReThink.CEE fellowship. The call will be out in the coming months, and our next cohort is expected to start in spring 2025. So thank you once again for being with us today, and I wish you a nice day or a nice evening ahead. Thank you.